Okay, so my thanks to INSA and to the organizers for inviting me here. Uh, Also, for taking a slightly difficult situation in the sense mathematics and society, the and society part is the difficult thing for us mathematicians. Uh, and this topic, calculus of finance, so finance of the world of finance, of course, it's a part of society, but does it have any more general lessons for society is a harder thing to say. But perhaps as we learn more about this world, we can also think a little bit about that. So, let's start very quickly. What is the general picture of mathematics and what a mathematician does? And one picture is that what we are about is pure imagination. We sit and we dream of different patterns and possibilities, and we come up with theories about them. But there's another view, which is that it comes out of practical problems. And of course, there's a very standard long list of how various kinds of mathematics has come about from the problems that society faces, and given a small list here. Right? So right from the start of civilization, as soon as we start thinking about any regular activity, having a calendar, just basic things like that, mathematics gets created. And then over the centuries, as you take up more and more issues, then more and more mathematics got created. And so that's certainly, one way to look at how mathematics comes into being. And there's this quote by Pura and Robbins in the book What is Mathematics? It says, all mathematical development has its roots in practical requirements. But once started under the pressure of applications, it inevitably gains momentum and transcends the confines of immediate utility. And so perhaps that is leading us back into the first thing that I had said. Also, this quote is perhaps a bit incomplete because it doesn't stop there. It, generally, as it transcends the confines of immediate utility, it starts becoming, once again, applicable to a wider range of problems, to problems which earlier one would not have thought that mathematics would have anything to do with them. And that is the picture I want to present for the world of finance today. So what is finance about? Here are some broad themes that, there are some assets, there are objects, there are processes, and you want to put a value to them. Okay? A very key thing is that we are planning for the future as we do this, and another thing is that we are trying to make profit, but we face risk while doing that, and so how do you understand this relationship and how do you strike a balance between the two? And so what do financial institutions do? They provide means of addressing these issues for investors, so they create tools and contracts through which investors can get into these issues and can plan for the future, can play off risk against profit, and can maybe balance these and hope for a safer world. And now, having said all this, what is the kind of mathematics that gets involved when we do this? It's obviously not surprising that probability and statistics is a big part of it, right? One is dealing with uncertainty, and that has to be there. The others are perhaps not so obvious, that differential equations can come into play, that things considered very pure, measure theory and function analysis can come into play. Optimization and numerical methods again are perhaps not so surprising. But you read a theoretical work on finance and you find things like the Hahn-Banach theorem and so on being used to prove different things. So one of the issues is what I have on top is, sort of at the intuitive level, but when you start really addressing it and you have to start formalizing to create results, right, then you get into the more serious math. And here's, picked up some blog posts. So, for instance, one of the things that has happened is that because of topics like this entering the world of finance, mathematicians do PhDs in maths, and also people knowledgeable about maths. So not just mathematicians, computer scientists, physicists have had a growing role to play in the world of finance. And so one sees articles about how Wall Street or financial institutions are hiring more and more of such people. Okay, but you also have headlines like this, which say, is this a good thing? I mean, what are we in for? And every time a crisis happens, you can expect headlines like this after that, trying to pass the blame onto the mathematical models that were being used by the investors and that perhaps had a role to play in the creation of that crisis. These are sort of typical routes, career paths that a person might have from basic study of mathematics or mathematical sciences and then into the world of finance. Here are a couple of people that I have known, and masters in maths or physics, and then PhD is still sticking to the purer parts of the subject, but then eventually, for instance, the first example, the MS physics and then the PhD physics. His PhD involves stochastic differential equations, and so it turned out that Morgan Stanley was trying to solve more or less the same stochastic differential equation, except they were studying investor behavior instead of particle behavior. Okay. And so he got a job there, and then he has stayed and he has risen in the ranks, and these are the kinds of things that he does: equity derivatives, gate computing, credit derivatives. On the right, someone who did his PhD in algebraic geometry had a postdoc at the Institute of Advanced Studies, but somehow over time he also got more interested in the finance world and got an MA in finance, and now is working with JP Morgan and has moved into again doing numerical PDs and applied learning. Okay, just to step back from this higher end and just to say again that this has been a concern of humanity from the start. Understanding how money works, how interest rates work, and so on. Here's a little problem from 4,000 years ago from Iraq. And this is on a clay tablet, and the question is, in how many years will an amount of money double if you charge 20% and compound annually? Now you can do a quick calculation and see that 3 years is too little and 4 years is too much. You will more than double over 4 years. And so what kind of answer did the Mesopotamians provide? This was their answer. 3 plus 47 by 63, right? Because they use base 60. So this is how they express their answer. They're not just saying it's somewhere between 3 and 4. It's a very precise answer. And what this is that you take 3 and 4, and it's a little less than 2 and a little more than 2, and so you do linear interpolation and figure out where exactly would you cross 2 if the interest were going linearly. And then in fact this is the exact answer that you would have. Okay? So linear interpolation can be seen in, for instance, in lots of problems related to accounting, related to taxation from ancient. Okay, but now let's come, I'll use a couple of very simple examples just to illustrate some issues that we face in even just thinking about the basics of finance. And here's a very simple looking thing. You've invested $100 and after a week you have got back $120, and the question is, have you made a profit? Right? So of course, the first temptation is to say, of course, there's a $20 profit. But it depends, right? So it depends on your relationship with those dollars. What if you are in India and first you have to acquire those dollars to do this investment, right? So if, for instance, I bought those dollars using rupees, now something else comes to play, the exchange rate, right? And then it's not so clear because it's quite possible that over that 1 week the exchange rate changed. Right? And if it changed from rupees 50 to $1, this is a very old example, right? The exchange rates are quite off by now. But it's just a sort of relatively small change in the exchange rate converts what we thought was a $20 gain to a loss when you look at it in rupees. So it's not just a question of what is the loss and the answer being different or profit and the answer being different in dollars and rupees, but what you see is as a profit in one way of measuring is a loss when you use another way of measuring from the same place. Okay, so that's a problem because this is not what we want to happen when we think, okay, let us change the units. We don't want profit and loss to become confused with each other. There's one way out, which is to sort of say, is there any extreme situation at least where we can be sure that we have made a profit? And that extreme situation is if you had an initial investment of 0 and you finally got something, then definitely you have made a profit. So situations like this are called arbitrage. Okay. Right? Then it doesn't depend on what the unit is for the second part. Right? It doesn't matter if it's dollars or rupees or so on. If you started with nothing and got something positive, then that stays the same. So that is the technical name for this sort of strategy, if you can pull it off. And, and there's an idea that such things should not really happen. And the basic idea is that if a strategy is available where you can make profit without investment, then every sensible person would of course try to do it, and that should basically kill the strategy. It would depend on something being over or underpriced, and people trying to exploit that would change the price and make this go away. So one can idealize this to and say that such a thing just should not happen. So that's called the no arbitrage principle. And so one can sort of have a view of what is the correct value to put on something. It's one which prevents this arbitrage. So now we have a principle which we can use to price. Okay, so there's a principle we can use to try and pricing. Let's also think, right, is there any intuitive way of pricing things? And one intuitive way to price things would be to say, if something is going to, have some random payoffs in the future, and how much would I be willing to pay for that now? So you could say, well, let's take the average, right? Let's take the expectation, and maybe that is what we should pay. And that is, in fact, is what the textbooks used to prescribe earlier on. But here's the thing, suppose you look at something like this. Consider a contract which ties you to selling $1 at a future time for a certain amount of rupees. And so this X is also written into the contract. Right? And so what we are going to say is, okay, if we apply this principle, then we would say this X should be the expected value of all the possible future prices. Okay. But what if you were doing the other thing, selling rupees for dollar? Then of course you should flip the exchange rate, and now you take the expectation of 1 upon ST. So these two things, and then the way the two prices have to match, that means Y should be 1 by X, right? Because we are flipping the trade. But these two expectations, 1 upon expectation ST and expectation 1 upon ST, are not going to be the same. Then said inequality tells us that as long as that ST is really random and has a variance, there's going to be this inequality. So this simple idea does not work right away. But on the other hand, this is how we would like things to be. So there is a way out. One way out is to go back to what we saw at the start, which was that the assessment of profit depends on what you use to measure the profit. So this is called numeraire in the finance literature. And we ran into a contradiction when we basically tried to have something that would work for all numeraires at one go, right? So whether we are selling in dollars or in rupees, we wanted something to work for both together. If we give up on that and do it separately for each one, then maybe we can have a chance of still doing it. And there's a fundamental theorem of asset pricing which sort of describes, now this is when all the things I've been talking informally. If you convert that into formal mathematical language, then you have a theorem which looks like this, and it's basically saying there is that. What it's saying is that here the P stands, let us say, for what the real probabilities are in the actual world. You don't want to work, if you try to impose them in all your calculations, it's not going to work, chances inequality will get in the way. But you can replace them by different allocations of probability, different allocation for each numeraire, and then have things work out for that. The second part does not permit a free lunch. These are again all technical terms. This is corresponding to the no arbitrage. Okay, so this is the thing, and yes, I think we seem to be invoking Germany a lot today. I guess we have Germany on our mind nowadays. So here's another quote from a German, and it says, mathematicians are like Frenchmen. Whatever you say to them, they translate into their own language, and forthwith it is something entirely different. And this is the reaction one could have to reading the fundamental theorem of asset pricing, especially if you look at it in a book on mathematical finance. It can be hard to figure out where is the finance sometimes. Okay? Okay, so a little bit of history about how we came to this situation and we came to have theorems like this. This story starts in 1900 with a PhD thesis in Paris, Louis Bachelier's thesis theory of speculation, supervised by Poincaré. He introduces Brownian motion, and it's interesting. Okay, the finance world is very proud of this, and it's a few years before Einstein introduces Brownian motion. I mean, for Brownian motion. Okay, but he introduces it to model price fluctuation, and he uses it to price different kinds of complicated contracts that people were building on top of the basic assets. And one interesting thing was that he also connected what he was doing to the heat equation. And in fact, Poincaré in his review of the thesis says that I wish that this aspect had been pursued a bit more. Okay. Alright, not too much happened with that. The economists were not in a position to appreciate the mathematics. The mathematicians were not so interested in this particular application. It got kind of people did read, so Kolmogorov has cited it in his probability book, but it didn't make a big impact. But eventually, the economists started looking at it again, and there was a set of papers by Black-Scholes and Merkel in the early 70s, benefiting from all the development of stochastic calculus that will happen in between. And it gives an explicit formula amenable to calculation for how to value different kinds of contracts. Building on the work of Bachellier. So this came at a time when computers were also growing. There was a need. The finance world also was sensing a need for certain contracts which they were not getting into because they didn't know how to price them. So this formula sort of came as a godsend to people at just the right time, and there was an explosion in the use of these complicated financial contracts called derivatives. Okay, so that's the positive side of the story. The real world has a way of not sort of letting you rest in peace for long. And so here are a couple of examples of how things can go wrong. Merkel and Scholes themselves co-founded a company along with professional fund managers called Long-Term Capital Management, and which basically said that was aimed at detecting and exploiting arbitrage opportunities. So once you have a formula that is based on no arbitrage principle, whenever that formula is violated, you figure, okay, that means there's an arbitrage opportunity there. So you locate and you try to exploit it while it is still there. Did very well for 3 years. Okay, and then was suddenly wiped out by a sequence of crises which hit its particular investments particularly hard. They had invested a lot in Russia. So the thing is, what was happening was that computer programs were written because you have to detect and act very fast. So these computer programs kind of take on a life of their own, and in identifying and trying to exploit arbitrage opportunities, they were led to various investments in Asia and Russia, so that when these two crises happened one after the other, they took a huge hit and were just wiped out. Ironically, given the name, they just lasted 3 years. Okay. Another kind of thing that can happen is there are these financial contracts called options, which allow you to basically bet on how certain asset prices can change, but with a very small initial investment. Right? So these are great if you're looking to make money quickly. And so they're popular for that. But on the flip side, of course, you can also get wiped out when you go for them. And so, for instance, here is a famous example. This is actually the result of a scam, but it just shows you, the kind of things that can happen through this. So, Barings Bank was given to bankruptcy in 1995 due to just one employee's rogue case. He made certain investments whose amounts in themselves were not so much, right? But they led the bank into obligations that were much, much bigger, and when things went wrong, there was a loss of $827 million, and that was more than the bank's available trading limit. So this is actually pretty much the last slide. Okay. Alright, so basically the thing is two things. One, all the nice theory is based on using the normal distribution to model your asset fluctuation, the price fluctuations. But the empirical evidence is pretty complete that the normal distribution is too well behaved to be a good fit to actual behavior. What you need are the heavy tail distributions. And here are some examples pointed out by Vandenberg, who has long been an advocate of long been arguing about the faults of the Brownian motion approach and trying to say you need a deeper approach. For instance, if you follow Brownian motion and fit the Dow Jones index data to it, then in the previous century there should have been about 58 days when the index moved by more than 3.4%. There were actually 1,000 such. And maybe an even more dramatic, an index swing of more than 7% should happen once in 300,000 years. It happened on 48 days in one century. And so I'll finish here, but here is the problem, that you can set up some basic principles, you can develop some very nice mathematical theory, it's very complete in itself, it's self-consistent and so on, but then you also have to match it to the real data. When you do that, you run into much more trouble. But when people have tried to but when you give up on the normal distribution and try to work with the heavy tail ones, the trouble you run into is that they have various parameters and we don't understand yet how to match them to the economic concept. So with the normal distribution we know, but with the others we do not. And so we are sort of in this halfway stage. You can have simpler models which look very nice and you understand everything has an intuitive interpretation and you can make arguments, conceptual arguments, or you can have more general distributions, but then at present you are just doing data fitting and you are not able to relate them to actual economic concepts. And I don't know, the society part of this is that this is one way in which these crashes are supposed to happen because the models have become so complicated. Right? If people can compute and people can obey and carry out the models, but they don't really understand what it means in terms of the underlying economic concept. So when things start going wrong, it is not realized. Okay? And people are not able to step back and step away from the models and switch to something. Okay, sorry, I should stop now.